Yeah, thanks a lot, Maria, for the introduction and also for the opportunity to give this seminar here in this community. That I'm really glad to be here. So I think that on this floor, this is something that all of us know, that we are really we are familiar with this curve. Like we are in a biodiversity crisis where we can observe this biodiversity decline with more than 1 million of species of animals and plants in danger of extinction. And of course, the models can really help us to detect and attribute what threats are behind these biodiversity chains. And of course, we have habitat loss, land use change, climate change, pollution that are under this curve. But an important step for conservation is if we can make this proactive conservation management. And for that, we really need to forecast how biodiversity is going to respond to all these changes. And we are working on this forecasting and biodiversity and trying to improve these predictions, but we still have a lot of uncertainty in those predictions. So I think that for these next years, a crucial step as a community is try to make use of all the data that is there and all the models and try to integrate them and see how we can reduce this uncertainty in our forecasting. And this is very important because we are in this loop where our community as researchers, we are guiding this monitoring biodiversity at different scales. This is quite important. We will see later how we need to consider these different scales. And with that, we can detect and attribute what are the threats behind these biodiversity declines, and we can forecast the biodiversity response. And this this information is what really policy needs and management. And then we can also come back again, and with that information, we can guide again and feedback on this monitoring biodiversity different scales. So we need to have in mind these forecasting values are really important for policy. So during this talk, I want to talk about biodiversity data challenges and then also about modeling challenges. And I will provide some examples, and in every example, you will see these icons. So you are going to be able to see where we are. So in biodiversity data now we are in a really boom era of biodiversity data. Now we have data from citizen science, from audio recordings, camera traps, molecular analysis, satellite. So now we are in an amazing era of collecting data in a new forms with new technologies. But of course, this data, we can see here, for example, the curve of the amount of GBIF data in the recent years, and we can see how it's increasing exponentially. So now we really need methods for big data. We are processing millions of occurrences, and probably this is going to be worse in the next years. But we also need to consider that all these data come with a lot of biases. We have biases in space, biases in time, we have more data now, and biases in taxonomy. And for example, here you can see the data, for example, in the right in the map, you can see each point is data where is informing the Living Planet Index, and we can see that it's not homogeneous in the space. And in the left, you can see how is this taxonomic bias, where we have only few taxonomic species as a species indicator, even that we have much more priority species. So this is an example of this spatial bias. So in the right, you can see ring recoveries, so recaptures of ring recoveries of the meadow pipit in Spain in the winter rain season. And in the left, you can see the human footprint, like with more red is like more human influence. And you can see how well correlated they are, no? Like you can see more points where there is more human influence. So if we want to use this ring recovery for biodiversity forecasting to see how the spatial distribution is going to change with climate change and global change and with everything, we need to be sure that we are not modeling where the people are looking for these animals, and like we can disentangle the ecological pattern that is behind that. And this is happening with a lot of biodiversity data. So in that sense, like we have here, for example, the occupancy pattern distribution of the deers, for example, in a spatial landscape. And of course, we have the ecological pattern that is actually the deer is there or not for different reasons, for habitat or whatever. But of course, we have this other layer that is the observation pattern, that is like we are actually able to detect or not detect the deer. So for example, if we repeat the visits like 3 times, maybe the deer is there, but we are able or not to detect. And it's essential that we disentangle this observation and the ecological pattern to really make robust inference about this ecological pattern. Some examples of these hierarchical levels and how we can use them. For example, here we ask like what factors are affecting wheatear bat community and habitat associations in southeastern United States. And we use a multi-species occupancy model. And with the multi-species approach, it's like we can really disentangle this observation process and ecological pattern, but we can also able to make inference for species that are rare or elusive, and usually we are not able to make these single species models. So we are going to have some community information, like how is respondent for habitat associations. For example, we saw that the community is larger with where it is more forest, but also where there is low management of these forests and like farther from humans. But also we have this information for all the species, even for species that usually we don't have a lot of data that are rare. So disentangle these two processes, we are able to do these community models. But not only with ecological patterns, so we can also use, for example, for wildlife conflict. And here we use this hierarchical model for understanding spatial patterns of poaching pressure at Golestan National Park in Iran. And disentangle this, we can see like what is driving these poaching events, and we identify that is this ungulate prey abundance, like poachers and leopard are looking for the same thing, and is what is driving these poaching events. And again, this information is very important for policy, because with that we can really inform where we need to increase the intensity of patrolling, increase the quality, where we can reduce that, and have like really strong implications in conservation. So these two examples, of course, we saw that like the importance of disentangle this observation pattern and ecological pattern. And we really need to understand that almost all data can fall in this preferential sampling problem on estimates of biodiversity change. So we usually don't have these random sampling protocols. We can have abundance bias. A lot of times, even researchers, even citizen science, go to places where they can see a lot of things, this abundance bias, or even a lot of species, the richness bias. With this example, I want to show you like what are the problems of not taking into account this preferential sampling. So for example, this is a study where we study the occupancy and the reproduction dynamics of a peripheral black stork population in Spain. We use more than 20 years data of nest occupancy, and this is quite important because have also a strong management implications, because this species is vulnerable in Spain. The thing is, like, when we look deeper in the data, we saw that it's a preferential sampling problem. So the rest are the people were going to places that they know they are successful. No, so we can see here a good correlation between site quality and site and visits. No, so if the nest is successful, there is more chance that the people come back the next year. The people that are making the surveys come back the next year to check this nest, and this can be very problematic if we are using this inference to guide conservation management. Because you can see here, the blue line is where in the model where we take into account this preferential sampling, and the other lines are models where we are not taking that into account. And we can see how we are overestimating the population if we are not considering this preferential sampling. So that means like we are extrapolating what is happening in the successful nest to all the population. And this can be, and at the end, we are using these numbers to guide conservation plans. So this bias is not really black and white. We have like a lot of grays and a lot of database from citizen science for academic research, museums, national parks have different type of bias. And sometimes we are obligated to choose one or another. And in a new project that I am involved now, we are trying to use these structured surveys where, for example, they are under this distance sampling protocol. We are making some population abundance measures, no? And how this relative abundance is changing across time. And we have this in different areas. But it's a clear advantage. So we have like a sampling design. We have this distance sampling where we can take into account this detection. But of course, there's a lot of resources needed for data collection. And we have a limitation of the spatiotemporal extent where we can infer these trends. On the other hand, we have the citizen science data that we can also make how this population abundance is changing through time. And we can do that for large spatiotemporal extents. However, there is no sampling design, and therefore we have inaccurate understanding of what is behind these trends. So the suggestion and what we are working now is like trying to integrate both data and try to leverage the advantage and disadvantage of both data sets. And using these hierarchical models where we can really have an observation process for each data set and integrate the data, we are able to see this relative abundance across time at different scales. So the good thing is like now we have more information to upscale and we can see these trends at different scales. And more important, that we have this scaling parameter. So the standardized data is like giving us the parameter and we are scaling it with the citizen science. We improve precision parameters. We can do it at broad spatiotemporal extent. But of course, there is a lot of model complexity and we really need to take care of that and play a lot with simulations to know like the model is doing what we know. But the nice thing is like we are also improving forecasting. So not really improving that like there is like different forecasting, but we are really reducing the uncertainty around this forecasting. So this integration of the data seems to have like a lot of future for forecasting. In terms of modeling challenges, I think that all of you are quite used to see this hexagon from Urban and colleagues, where they introduced these 6 key mechanisms to predict biodiversity response to global change. And we can see how is the adaptation, environment, physiology, demography, dispersal, biotic interactions, like how we need to take into account this process and introducing the modeling to really improve or understand how biodiversity is responding. And we saw that we are not really doing that. Only 25% of studies is at least using one mechanism. And of course, also we have the problem of these hierarchical levels. So here we can see that like we need to monitor and also to model at different levels of the community, so from the individuals to ecosystems, but also in the spatio-temporal scales, because each of these processes are in different locations in this graph that you can see here across the hierarchical levels. And in a recent review that we made about how these models are applied in conservation and restoration, so you can see here the ecological level from genes to ecosystems and the relevant process. And we divide the models in static and dynamic. And we saw that almost 80% of the models that we are using for conservation are static. And this can be a bit problematic if we want to predict how a species is going to respond to global change, because with this static, we are using a snapshot of what is happening. And with that, we really not understand the mechanisms that is behind this pattern. And without understanding that, it's very difficult to make predictions. So even if we have a really good view of what is happening now, this doesn't mean like we are going to be able to predict what is happening. So if we want to move to understand this range dynamics, we need to move more in a movie framework where we can introduce, for example, dispersal, biotic interactions, and really understand the mechanisms like the colonization and extinction dynamics that is behind the range dynamics. So in this example, we try to understand where and large carnivores will likely expand into human-dominated landscapes. And usually this has been done with this snapshot framework. And now, what we wanted is try to move into more dynamic models and try to incorporate dispersal. And this also will be very important, again, to guide these proactive conservation measures that can really help for human-wildlife conflict. And we did that for the bear and the Iberian lynx in the Iberian Peninsula. And here you can see in dark red where the species actually are in the Iberian Peninsula, and in light red where there is the suitable habitat. And you can see that there is plenty of suitable habitat, but what we have is a lot of uncertainty that how these animals will colonize, or if they will colonize this habitat. So we make different models with high barrier, high anthropogenic barrier, and low anthropogenic barrier, and try to understand how this anthropogenic barrier, so anthropogenic influence, this range dynamics. So taking talk on the dispersal, we try to see how this colonization is going to happen with different levels of barriers. And this is really helping us to understand where the humans, where the anthropogenic barriers are going to really affect the colonization dynamics of these large carnivores. And again, we can really use this information to create these proactive conservation measures. So now I hope that I convince you, okay, we need to move into a dynamic framework, and perfect. But of course, these dynamic approaches have some limitations. They need a lot of data, and we need a lot of resource for this data. So in this work, we ask, is really worth it, or what we are gaining in going to this dynamic compared to static approaches. And we compare these dynamic and static distribution models in spatial prediction, in the dead population trends, and in imperfect detection. Using SWIX monitoring data for birds, for example, here you can see the Eurasian skylark example, and we run different models, as you can see here in the live, dynamic detection, dynamic occupancy models, dynamic occupancy model, but without detection, static models, and we use all this and run and evaluate how these spatial prediction and temporal predictions how good or how bad they were. And we saw that, we don't have a best model always. So depending on what is the question and what we want to do, we have better models. And for example, we see that for temporal and to detect these temporal dynamics, Of course, the dynamic occupancy model seems the best, but for the spatial predictions, for example, in contrast are the static models, the booster regression trees. So it always depends of what we want to do, if it is worth it or not to move into a dynamic approach. So we are speaking about like this paper about urban, about these 6 mechanisms and how important it is to introduce in the models. But the question is like why we are not using more process-explicit models. And again, like one of the challenges like this data limitation and additional expertise. So together with Damaris Turel, we try to focus more on dispersal. And we realized that we really have a lack of empirical data for describing dispersal. So we base in this amazing paper from '98 in Paradise that they measure dispersal for 75 species. They provide the mean and the standard deviation, but it was only in UK. And from this empirical dispersal data, that for birds, that is like one of the most studied taxons, we have all the information, and we thought, okay, but what happened with all the other species? Like we have some inference, we can provide more empirical dispersal estimates about the other species. So we decided to use a similar approach of urine. So using this volunteer monitoring database of ring recoveries that I already introduced you, we try to provide these empirical dispersal estimates for all Europe and for more species. But of course, as I said before, there is a lot of biases behind that, and spatial biases, temporal biases. We have migratory movements that we really need to detect to take it out, because if not, we are going to overestimate the dispersal. And of course, we have the problem of like every country is reporting the rings in different ways. So we need to take all this into account. At the end, we fit different functions and provide dispersal kernel for 274 species. And we think that this data is going to really help to move into these process-based models, because with this data, we can really incorporate dispersal in the models of range dynamics. And to finish, I think that like a future perspective, like an example of how we can develop these process-explicit models, again with Damaris Turel and her lab, using RainShifter R, that they develop these R packets that can really integrate a lot of these mechanisms like demography, dispersal, genetics, and make individualized models, taking all this into account. Here we use for these examples where we integrate data from different resources, and also we provide an ecological theory framework. So with all this information, we integrate with a Bayesian calibration that can really help us for like, okay, we have some prior knowledge of from this data, but we can introduce in a livelihood, and this will create these posterior estimates that can really help us to also have a degree of uncertainty across, of the parameters. So with that, we can make predictions, spatial prediction, temporal predictions, and have different outcomes that, yeah, as I told before, like can be very important for conservation management. And an important step that usually we don't have in these process-specific models is the validation. And here, Anne implement a spatial cross-validation to evaluate this predictive. So we did that for the red kite and with the Swiss monitoring data, and we make these spatial predictions and see how this range is going to change, was changing and is going to change, and also make the model that you can see here on the right of the relative abundance across time until now, but also like try to see in the future how it's going to respond to this relative abundance. We can see that the red points are the observed and the blue line is the simulation, and we can see that we can have like really confidence in the model that is working quite well, and we see that the population is going to be stable after few decades. So at the end, the take-home message, like we need this model biodiversity assessment for proactive conservation methods, conservation management. We need to develop a biodiversity monitoring framework across ecological scales. And here, I know that GeoBomb is really working on that and really providing a super nice framework where we don't need to collect all data everywhere. But what we need is like essential variables in a specific place and across time, and this will really help us to make better predictions. We need to improve the calibration and the validation of dynamic modeling approach. So compared to the static and the correlative approach, we are still behind of this statistical toolbox. And of course, very important that we really need to understand how important is the analysis and the communication of the biodiversity data and modeling uncertainty. So we really need to know this uncertainty and how important it is to make like how to use our biodiversity predictions. Yeah, so of course this is a teamwork. Yeah, I use like works and that I developed with all these colleagues. Thank you for listening and happy to answer any question.
Thank you very much, Guillermo. It was really interesting, at least for me. Do we have any questions from the audience? While the questions accumulate, perhaps I can start with one question. It was really interesting for me to see this trade-off between the temporal and spatial like predictions when you showed for dynamic and static models that like when we are good at when we are good at predicting the spatial patterns, but we are not really good at predicting the temporal patterns, if I understand correctly. I was very curious if you have any insights why this really happens, in the sense if we are not really good at integrating the processes at the temporal level or spatial level, or it's because of the data lacks. Do you have any insights about that?
Yeah, I mean, this was very interesting because we learned a lot of like what is behind our predictions, and the data is, I mean, is awesome. I mean, like it's super good data here in Switzerland. They have like a super good monitoring frameworks for a long time. And the problem, like we see that, of course, depend on the question, but also depend of like, for example, if the species is declining or have like a stable population. So if it is a stable population, these dynamic models are not really capturing the trend, but of course, because it's stable, and the same with the spatial predictions. So we detect that like depending of like the question, also depending of like how is the trend and the spatial range dynamics, like these models are going to be more able to capture the mechanisms behind that.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. It's really interesting. Yeah, Tom has a question.
Hi, great talk. Thank you for that. You did kind of touch on this at parts throughout, but it'd be useful to just hear your thoughts a little bit more. So in my experience, there is a really difficult trade-off between trying to fit these complex models that recognize all of these different processes and then actually having the data quality in order to actually fit the models that we think exist for those processes. What do you think, how far do you think we can take this? How far can we integrate these processes into models before we think the data just isn't going to cut it? The data is just not good enough.
Oh, yeah, it's a good question because, as you say, like usually currently we try to really stress our data and our models, and we are trying to do our best when we have some data. But I think that this model complexity is really a trade-off, and we really need to take care about, yeah, as I explained, like about like the data quality. but also with model complexity and model flexibility, also came a lot of uncertainty and a lot of drawbacks. No, I mean, like, and we really need to take care of that. And for me, I think that the simulations can play really an important role. So first, before using real data, maybe we really need to understand like what is happening or like what is doing our model and complex models with the data, like we know what is happening. I think that in the future, like I hope that we see more this simulation and sensitivity analysis of like of this model complexity. And yeah, and of course, these trade-offs come with a lot of with the questions, no? For what goal and what are our questions, like why we want to implement this model, and I think that I will go always for the simple model to answer these questions, because at the end, this model complexity comes with a lot of things behind.
Thank you. Great talk.
We have other questions. Yeah, it's done.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. Thank you for this great presentation. I was just wondering, so you mentioned a lot of data problems, but if I haven't missed it, I think you haven't mentioned, for example, data latency. I was wondering if it's an issue in this line of work, or to what extent it's an issue.
What do you mean, like with latency, like
Latency.
lag time?
Sorry?
Like, sorry, no, like what do you mean with latency?
The amount, the timing that when you receive new data.
Yeah. Like this, yeah, of course, we also have this temporal bias, and the problem of that, I mean, it's a lot of issues, and I'm also working with some like try to see this temporal bias and how this information can really affect our estimates. And the problem with the temporal bias is that we usually don't have, for example, a reference, and we don't know if like what we are seeing is like already changing because something happened in the past and something not. And the lack of reference can really affect also our predictions. And like what also worry me is like the combination of this spatiotemporal bias, because sometimes we focus on the temporal, but we don't have a space, and sometimes we focus on the space and we don't have the temporal information, and the combination of both can really affect our estimates. But yeah, like really good point. This temporal bias can also affect our predictions.
Thank you. Great answer. Thanks.
Jenny, please go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes. Hi, Jenny.
Thanks for an excellent talk. It's a really great range of work. You mentioned conservation a lot, and I think GeoBond particularly is trying to think about conservation worldwide. I just wondered what you thought about really what people are currently using for conservation worldwide compared to what you've been doing. So they might, for example, just take a worldwide map of forest and cookie cut that around species distributions and say, we need to preserve this forest. And that might not be such a bad first line of protection of what to do. So you didn't talk much about land use and land use mapping, but I don't know how much that was a key part of all the models you've done. But I think that's where policymakers have probably the most levers to change. We have levers to change land use. We can't really change climate change on except by kind of global action that isn't spatially explicit, if you see what I mean. I'm not really phrasing my question very well, but I was just wondering where you think your models might meet the extremely simple conservation assumptions that people might use of just let's put a line around the habitat, the primary habitat, the primary forest.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good point. I think that I understand your point that, and I think that is not a simple answer to that. I think that what we really need to take care is like we monitor and we model biodiversity at these different scales, and so I think that like the local scale will be as much as important as having this global assessment. And with land use, of course, maybe we have different hypotheses of how it affect in this ecological scale framework. So usually we have the land use or habitat fragmentation maybe affect in more local scales, and this global change and climate change will affect more in larger scales. And at the end, like what we are missing is like these have a lot of feedbacks, no? And how the individuals are responding to these changes also affect to the population and to the ecosystems. And of course, we are losing a lot of emergent properties or emergent patterns that appear that maybe the species and the individuals are not doing this pattern, but we can see that in a more macroecological scale. And what we really need, I think, that like as a future avenue is like to really integrate more this assessment and having more models that make this cross-scale assessment. And this would be really helpful for conservation, because this multi-scale approach in monitoring and in model, of course, is challenging, but I think that we are missing this part a lot.
Thanks. That's a great idea.
Yes, Cara.
Hi, Cara.
Nice to see you. Thanks for a super nice talk. I really enjoyed it. Yeah, I was curious. I was going back a bit to and thinking about the kind of model comparison project that you did and some of the thoughts that have been coming up in the discussion. And I was thinking that, for these like mechanistic models, usually, people make a model and they test it maybe against some empirical data and say how well it fits, but that's usually the end of it. And so there's not really this, like, in my experience, this kind of effort or kind of expectation to compare alternative models in the same way that you see with statistical models. I was wondering what your thoughts would be if you think this is something that could become more thought of as like a component of the modeling process when it comes to these process-based models, and maybe the comparison to simulated data, like you said. But is that feasible when they do take so much time and data to implement these more complex models? I was just curious about your thoughts with that.
Yeah, super good question. I mean, it's something, for example, that I have discussing with Amaris for a lot. And like we have compared with this statistics approach, like where we have a lot of standard protocols, we have a really good statistical toolbox, like where the people really know, and the researchers and the users really know, like how these steps and how we need the validation, how we need the calibration. And I think that there is a lot of tools to do that, and it's quite implemented in the community, like the need of do this validation, to do prediction and everything. As you say, like with this more mechanistic approach and dynamic approach, because there is no data or because it's very time consuming, we don't have this we don't see a lot of validation and prediction and these things. And I think that we really need to work as a community to develop a protocol or I don't know, like a bunch of tools that can really help, like that the people when are using the model need to know, like, okay, you need to really validate that, and like implement something like in a static approaches, like we have a set of tools and the people can use that in a very simple way. But of course, it's going to be more time consuming and more data. So it's more challenging developing this. But I think that the next steps will be to try to develop this statistical toolbox in dynamic and mechanistic approach.
Yeah, that sounds great. Thanks.
Any other questions? If not, I think we can stop here. Thank you very much once again, Guillermo.